Hello, and welcome to the Catching the Octopus podcast. Here, we will explore how connecting inward gives us an advantage outward. We openly talk about the obstacles and challenges and difficulties that life throws our way and how they become moments of gratitude and things that can benefit us when we look back on our lives. I'm your host, Niomi Hurley, and it is my mission to bring you top quality guests that will share with you openly their obstacles and also the techniques they use to go inward that strengthens the way that they serve themselves and others at the highest level. Thank you for joining. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. In today's episode, we're going to do a recap of the interview that I had with Peter Banigo. Now, Peter is the founder of Target ICC, which is a tech consulting company, and he helps people with their tech. He's based in Nigeria, and we had a great chat. It was quite comical. We had a few laughs along the way, but there was also some great gold nuggets that he shared. So Peter originally had numerous businesses and he condensed his focus just down to one. And he chose the one that came easy to him, the one that he was most interested in and pretty much was in his zone of genius. And so we talked a little bit in the episode about focusing on that one thing and then doing that well. Now, this is a bit in contradiction to how I present, because those of you that know me know I wear many hats. I run this podcast. Within my business itself, I do elements of leadership capacity building with the Ripple Effect leadership psychology program. I also do individual one-on-one sessions in the space of hypnotherapy, with RTT and most recently with past life regressions through hypnosis. So I also volunteer in some spaces. So I've got lots going on. But the key element of what keeps me excited is all of them have a common theme, and that common theme is people, right? So I'm dealing with people in all of them and I'm upgrading people. So that's the one thing I do that I focus on, that I'm doing well. So you can have numerous projects, but really just streamline them into what you do well and what's in your zone of genius, because then it's never going to be a chore, right? And it's always going to come natural and easy to you. And really, that's what I would tell anyone who's going into business. Choose something that comes naturally to you and that sits in your zone of genius, because that's where we can make the most impact. He also talked about stories that he'd created for himself, not just through his childhood, but also through stereotyping of Nigeria and how, the prince over there wants to give money or marry someone and give money. And so he talked about reframing that story he's created about yourself. One of the main elements he touched on was being an introvert. Now, he said he'd always been an introvert, but then he had to look at that and reframe that and go, well, am I really an introvert, or is it just some of my particular behaviours fall into that introvert category? And can I change that? He talked about, emailing people rather than talking to them and all of that apprehension around that sort of thing. And now he's running his own podcast, right, and running his business quite successfully. So it's great that we have personality profiling and different categories that we put people in. And that does, as leaders, help us understand. But we have to be careful that we're not setting up paradigms for these people as well, that then creates an identity for them. Because when someone creates their own identity and grasps onto these labels, then it can be harder to influence them to behave differently. And this I see sometimes as well in the one-to-one sessions. If someone's had a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, they can sometimes group onto that and that becomes their identity. So when they're trying to do some personal growth and some change around that, they tend to say, well, this is me, like I am this. But giving it I am takes ownership of that. And anyone that's dealt with the subconscious or understands the subconscious knows that we don't tell it things that we don't want it to grab onto, right? We don't tell the mind. So, I have been diagnosed with, or I show symptoms of is a better way of discussing those sorts of things rather than I am. So if you're in that introvert space and you're wanting to do a shift there, or if you're too extroverted and you're wanting to do a shift there, instead of saying I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert, it could be more like I show introvert tendencies, but I'm going to work on X, Y, Z, or I tend to take the role of an extrovert. However, I want to sit back and listen more and really take in some conversation. So whatever we tell our brain, it believes it. Now, then he went into being present, right? And reducing pressure and stress and tension by staying in the present rather than putting the attention into the future. And there's a meme that floats around, you may or may not have seen it, that pretty much says anxiety and depression are elements of living in the past or living in the future. But if we focus on the present moment and what's happening right here and right now, there is nothing to fear unless we're standing on the edge of a cliff, right? But that's healthy fear. We need to have that fear. But usually our anxiety comes from imagining what's going to be happening in the future, and that creates some anxious feelings in us. Or if someone's suffering from an anxiety condition, that can be prolonged exposure to that future now becomes what they experience in the here and now. But if you come back to that present moment, and you can do that through mindfulness and meditation and a whole range of other things, that can actually create less stress, less tension, and less pressure on us in the moment. And when we can get to a point where we remove the stress, the pressure, the tension, then we can actually connect with self better. We make better decisions. We are able to see more clearly instead of having that cloud that hangs over us. And there's some of the ways that he did the reframing and he did the reducing of that pressure, stress, and tension was through making the unfamiliar familiar. And you would have heard me talk about this before, I'm sure, but the brain likes what's familiar. So when we're going through periods of growth and transformation and development, the brain will grab onto what's familiar and will keep a hold of that as tight as it can because that's where it's safe, right? So when we're stepping into these areas that are unfamiliar, that can feel uncomfortable and awkward. And we can tend to sometimes, mainly on a subconscious level, revert back to those familiar areas. So if we want to change, if we want to be great leaders, if we want to step up and be able to lead and serve the teams that we have around us, or even just our roles in the community or in our family, then making the unfamiliar familiar is the first step. You know, putting yourself in situations that feel uncomfortable and awkward and doing it often. And before too long, the mind will actually pick up and go, oh, we've done this before. It's not that bad. And it becomes less of an impact. Now, going back to the element of Nigeria and the stereotyping around that, for Peter, that actually created in him this expectation of others, and that gave him some limiting beliefs that would stop him from time to time from taking action, right? Because he was wearing that stereotype, or it was in front of his mind, and it was messing with some of his decisions. It was messing with some of the action steps that he wanted to take. And so one of the things that he learned throughout his journey in this space was not letting the expectations of others mess with your mind. And this has been quite a big space for me to step into as well, because I have such a systemized, logical mind, and that has been my whole career. And, you know, I've established myself well within the community that I'm in the business community. And, you know, a fair few people know me and know what I'm about. But I'm stepping into a different space that has a little bit more energy relationship to it. And, you know, past lives, not everyone has a belief system that incorporates that. So, you know, thinking that other people are going to think I'm crazy or weird or all of that sort of stuff over the last 6 months has actually impacted some of the decisions that I've made and some of the actions that I haven't taken, right? It's hindered me because I was concerned and worried about the expectations of others. Now, this is just natural because we're social creatures. And back in the day, you know, when we were living in tribes, we are wired, our mammalian brain, or reptilian brain rather, is wired to want to stay safe. And so what it does is going, okay, if I've got my social group around me, then I'm safe, because we had to live in tribes, right? If we were sent away and ostracized, then we weren't able to hunt. If we were sick, we were open to predators, and it put us in a very vulnerable space. Now, that's not the way it is today, because even if you live by yourself, you can still survive, right? You can get online shopping, you can get in a cleaner, you can even go online and interact with people, right? So, excuse me, it's a very different space to be in today, but our mind is still connected to the yesteryear. So thinking about where we sit, what our belief systems are, what our identity that we're given ourselves is, and is that based around the expectation of others? Generally, it is, right? Whether that be from conditioning as we were growing up, whether our teenage years conditioned us, whether our workplace even has conditioned us, or our members of our family as adults. That can mess with our mind, and that can set us up to sometimes not believe things are available to us, or not believe that we are worthy or enough. And so we won't take those steps, or we have this fear of being judged. Now, with the space that I'm stepping into, if someone judges me or doesn't know me well enough to know who I am, then that's not really on me, right? I can't own that. I've just got to show up in my most authentic space, serve people at my highest level, and know that I'm being able to create change in the world. And we're not going to connect with everyone. Scientifically proven, not everyone's going to be our tribe, right? And that's okay.
If you're enjoying this podcast and you want Niomi or any of her guests featured on your podcast or as a keynote speaker at your next event, you'll find their contact details included in the show notes. If you'd like to learn more about how you can work with Niomi individually or as part of your strategy to improve leadership in your business, then review the courses, offers and services at getupandgoconsulting.com.au.
So not letting those expectations of others mess with your mind then opens up a whole range of opportunities for you. And so that led into what he was saying about just taking the first step, right? He did have a little bit of perfectionism in him, and I do too. So I did relate to that space. But when you're ready, just take the first step. As he said, you can't wait forever for things to be perfect or in the right place or to be the right time. And this really connects with me as well when I see, young people starting families, right? And they're like, oh, I just want to go and pay this off, or I want to go do this travel, or I want to go do this. But the thing is, there's never going to be a right time, because you're always going to find that next thing that needs to be done. And that's the same within business. If we're just not just taking the step and putting ourselves out there, then people aren't aware of our services, right? So they're not going to engage in us. And we could have something completely perfect, but that might not connect with people anyway. So taking that first step, putting our services out, going in and networking, that allows us to refine our products. That allows us to refine our approaches to people as well. And you go by trial and error, you pivot here, you turn there, you relaunch here, you redo this there until something actually clicks. But if you're just doing this all in your head, you don't have those learnings, right? Which can actually be something that holds us back. Someone else said to me, a product launched is better than a product on the shelf waiting to be perfect, because it's just never going to sell. So when we're looking at that sort of space, just being aware of what is holding us back. And do I need the perfect color, the perfect font, when I'm doing some of these things, or do I just need to get it out there? Some people may be aware of this already, but what I've done in some of my presentations that I do in some of the training and the webinars is I've actually purposely put errors scattered throughout them. And for me, that was actually to make me familiar with things not being perfect, right? So I took my own advice, make the unfamiliar familiar. And a lot of the times when I'm skipping through, I see the error and I just keep going. Right. In early days, if I had an error in one of my slides or in something that I was sending out, I would go into this full-blown apology. Oh, sorry about that typo. And I'd write it down to go and fix it later. No one else saw it. right? I was just bringing attention to this error there. So it's really important to know that done is better than perfecting something to be done. And, even now, if some people pick up on the error and go, oh, I see an error in there, I'm like, oh, thank you very much for letting me know that. And I don't fix it. I leave it for the next person. But it's very rare that someone will actually pick it up and say something. It actually surprised me, little experiment that I did there. But by making it familiar, making those errors and seeing those and knowing I'm not perfect and I'm just human, I'm infallible, has been really essential in me for helping me change my belief systems around just taking the first step. Because sometimes we can self-sabotage as well, right? We can go, well, if it's not perfect, that gives us an excuse not to go and launch it, because if no one buys it, I'm not going to feel bad because it wasn't launched anyway. And it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. And looking at the way that people look at us or stereotype us or put us in a box, it doesn't define who we are anyway, right? And a lot of those times, the way that we think people will respond to us is usually just perceived. It's very rarely actually true. And I've surprised myself lately when I've been sharing with people about this new service that I offer in the past life space, that so many people are intrigued and they want to know more. And I was kind of like a bit shocked, waiting for their energy to change and cut off from me and me feel like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I've been rejected, I'm not enough, and all the stuff that goes through from a subconscious space. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter how much work you do on yourself, doesn't matter where you get to, there's always going to be something that pops up that questions your enoughness. It's just part of being human, right? So not looking at the stereotypes that we're given and taking those on board. And, that can be for all different cultures that are coming into work environments or starting businesses. It can be gender specific. It can be, sexual preferences, all of those sorts of things. We can sometimes think people are going to judge us or see us in a particular way. And usually they don't. Usually it's just stuff we've made up to either validate our own belief systems or to self-sabotage, where we could be going out and stepping into that unfamiliar zone and making it familiar. So he also spoke about going through a space of self-reflection and identifying and being aware of your challenges. And I like to call this brutal self-honesty, right? What is it that you don't do well? And there's stuff that we all don't do well. But when we become aware of that, and aware of the challenges we have, then we can use some life hacks, right, to set us up and set our future self up for success. So he talked about his memory not being really great, and he knows that he's very forgetful on things. So he has a notepad in his pocket where he can write things down. And I know myself, I have so much going on, right? So much information coming in that it's not possible to store it all. So I very commonly use my notes within my phone to just jot things down when I have an idea or something comes up. I use my calendar a lot. And if something's not in my calendar, I don't show up to it, because I rely really heavily on that telling me where I'm meant to be and who I'm meant to meet and what programs I have in place. So I have to be diligent, obviously, as something comes up, to put it straight in my calendar, but I've learned that that's how I set future me up for success. I also talked about, the alarm that I have on my phone for picking my daughter up, and that's not just so I don't forget her. Obviously, it does play that card, but what it does do is it prevents my cognitive space and my cognitive resources from having to focus on the time when it's coming to school pickup, right? Because I know that the alarm's going to catch me. So I can just go all in, focus 100% on what I'm doing, knowing that I'll get an alert when I need to. And that we have to be aware of as well, because sometimes, especially when we're in a space of stress or we've got the anxiety symptoms that are coming through, they all take up cognitive resources, right? So if we want to show up as our best selves, we can't do that while we have those other weights and those other things taking up that space. So becoming aware of the challenges and using those life hacks to set you up for future success is really important, but it's equally as important to recognize your strengths in business and work with them. right? Don't pressure yourself to be able to do everything. If there's something that you're not great at, call in some help, call in some resources. One of your strengths in business might be implementing things, but not generating ideas. Create a think tank. Go and get some people in your network to get together and nut out some ideas. Find someone else that's done what you've already done before and ask them to be your mentor. Ask them questions, pick their brain and try and get to a space where you're a little bit more knowledgeable in that area. But you don't have to pressure yourself. Again, this is that self-imposed stuff that will stop us and hinder us from moving forward. Because when we've got this pressure to be perfect or this pressure to do everything, we can spread ourselves really thin and not be able to do the key things we do well as we should be. So find out what your strength is in your business. It might be the accounting side of things. It might be the marketing and the creative side of things. It might be the delivery of different things. So finding that out allows you then to play to your strengths and work to your strengths within your business and outsource or get support for all of those other areas. So we talked a little bit about that cognitive load and before, but in the interview, we went a little bit deeper and we spoke about that information overload. And it doesn't matter where you look at the moment, social media, TV, YouTube, everywhere, Google, anything you're looking for, there is so much information out there. And we're living in a space where that can become overwhelming in itself. So if we want to learn something and we Google it, then we've got heaps of different options to go through instead of just one jumping out to us. And I found this myself when I was starting my podcast, right? So I started going, okay, I want to do a podcast, came up with the idea, started collecting all the gear, was ready and thought, right, I'm going to launch. And then I was like, well, how am I going to do that? So I did some research and they talked about podcast hosting platforms and conversion of videos and things. I'm like, all right, cool. I'll do some research on this. So I Googled top podcast hosting platforms and 5 came up. I thought I'll just pick the one on the top, but it didn't suit me, right? Then I went to the second, the third, the fourth. So then I had to research all the different ones. I asked in podcasting groups, which do you use? Everyone had a different one, right? So there's so much information out there that at times we have to really decipher through what we're being presented with to find those gold nuggets. So removing the need for your brain to store information it doesn't need is really important so that we can maximize the processing capabilities. And, doing our own research or feeling where our intuition wants to go is important. But it also goes back to that step as well of someone who's done it before, someone that you can trust, someone you have a relationship with, or someone you build a relationship with that can help share information with you or find the good spaces to get that information from, right? Because there's so many teachers out there of so many different things and not everyone is going to gel with you and you're not going to gel with everyone. So if you're not open to the teacher or the method that it's being taught in or anything like that, your retention is going to be less. So making sure we connect is the first step. And then also then removing anything we don't need out of our brain, right? So that we can maximize the processing when we're learning new things and we're trying to implant those things into our life. Now, as I said before, I'm a huge fan of writing things down. I think it's really great. I am a list kind of gal, right? I do have my lists going on that I tick off just to keep me in track and I can add things to them all the time. Now, sometimes the things on my list don't get done because other priorities come in and that's okay, but I've still got them there. And that's going back to what we're saying before of focusing on that one thing. What is the one thing that if you did it now, everything else would be superfluous? I can't even say the word. Think about where you want to be at this point in time, whether it's something personal you want to achieve, whether it's something in a relationship, whether it's something professional in your business, whether it's a growth element, whether it's a physical challenge that you want to get to. Have a look at whatever it is that you want right now and think about all of the things that you would need to do to get there. Yeah, fine. Get a list of about 5 And then out of that 5, have a look and pick the one thing that if you did that, everything else would come secondary or may not even need to be done. And once you can nail that down, that can give you some strong focus on where to go from there. So that was a little bit of a summary on the episode with Peter. You know, he shared with us how powerful it is to not let the expectations from others mess with our mind or our hopes or our dreams, or even what we think is possible to achieve. He also shared, you know, taking that first step and not waiting for everything to be perfect. Otherwise, you'll be waiting forever. And also reducing that pressure, stress, and tension by putting our attention into the now rather than putting it into the future. So the last key element was making the unfamiliar familiar, right? Setting our future self up for success so that we can accomplish anything that we set our minds to. So if you haven't listened to the episode and you're interested, go and check it out. I think it was episode 54, I think, from Peter. So I'm starting to crank up some episodes, which is really great. And if you've got any questions or you want to reach out to Peter, feel free. If you want to reach out to me and learn a bit more, then you can do that too. So thank you very much for joining me in this episode, and I look forward to serving you in our next episode. Thanks for joining in and listening to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. It's been great having you here. And if you'd like to go and like and subscribe and maybe even leave a 5-star rating if you think it's worth it, I'd really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in our next episode.